The Battle of Minden was fought in 1759 in northwest Europe during the 7 Years' War. Now, it used to be considered one of the great British battles, but of course, the Second World War and indeed the First World War have kind of interposed themselves in people's thinking. So it's faded a little bit, but it's still celebrated by the regiments and batteries that took part in it. There we are. I first fell in love with Minden when I was a schoolboy because I was given a prize that had this marvelous illustration in it. So when I was posted to the British Army of the Rhine during the Cold War, it wasn't a punishment posting for me. And during Operation Granby, there's a name to conjure with, Minden came with me, as you can see from the name of my vehicle as a medical squadron commander. But back in Minden itself, I used to, like Dudley, conduct battlefield tours for my brigade headquarters and for various officers' messes. And a question that I was constantly asked was, if this was a battle won by the British infantry and artillery, why is this monument, which the Germans erected on the centenary, why is it in the wrong place? Because it's certainly not where the main body of the British were deployed. Hopefully, at the end of this talk, you'll understand why. There's the sequence that I'm going to adopt for you. You'll get a bit of background to the 7 Years' War, then look at why the Brits were in Northwest Europe. Obviously, we need to understand the terrain. And then one of my favorite parts is the French capturing Minden. We need to look at the respective preparations and plans. And then we divert slightly 15 kilometers to the south to Gofeld, where there was a concurrent battle, which was part of the design for Minden. The meat in the sandwich is Minden, and I'll break that down into 5 phases when we come to it. And then last but not least, we'll look at the consequences and sequelae of the battle. Now, my talk will take just shy of 60 minutes, but Dudley's happy for me to run over in terms of the question and answer session. So please feel free to pose questions. I'll give you some hints, though, as we go along. So the 7 Years' War, middle of the 18th century, a period of cabinet wars, 3-cornered hats, heavy wool uniform. And this is a typical soldier of the period, armed with a muzzle-loading, smoothbore flintlock musket. The principal arms of the period, the foot or infantry, the horse or cavalry, artillery, but there were also logistic, engineering, medical, and staff functions. The soldiers of the day, as I said, armed with pretty primitive musketry, inaccurate as a lonesome weapon, but when fired together at mass targets could be pretty lethal. The effective range, about 80 meters, about 80 paces. The artillery was just a bigger version of the same, with a range of between 1,000 and 2,000 meters. And the cavalry trooper on his horse, usually armed with a saber, possibly with a brace of pistols, and possibly also with a carbine. So looking at the background to it, more than 260 years ago, the major powers of Europe became enmeshed in the 7 Years' War. And it lasted formally from 1756 until 1763. But in actual fact, conflict had already broken out in North America and in India, where Britain and France were vying for colonial supremacy. Now, the seeds of war are often sown in previous conflicts, or as an outcome of a previous conflict. And in Europe, the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria had built an alliance with the aim of recovering Silesia from Prussia, which had seized it during the War of the Austrian Succession. Britain and Prussia were in alliance with a host of North German states, particularly Hanover, and latterly Portugal. And opposing them were just about everybody else: France, Austria, Russia, Saxony, Sweden, and eventually Spain. Now, to my simple way of thinking, the 7 Years' War could perhaps be divided into two major sub-conflicts, those between Britain and France, and between Frederick the Great of Prussia and just about everyone else. But the two sub-conflicts were not mutually exclusive. They overlapped, and Minden is an example of that. In 1756, France got the upper hand in North America, and this continued into the following years until in 1759, the British won decisively at Quebec. Halfway around the world, the British were making better headway in India, conquering Bengal. In Europe, Frederick the Great made a preemptive strike against Maria Theresa by invading Saxony in 1756. After early success, he was forced on the defensive by the defeat at Kolin and had to oppose Austria in Silesia, France in Saxony, and Russians to his east. He recovered the initiative through the significant victories at Rossbach and Leuthen, and he then conducted a largely successful, if exhausting, war on all fronts through until 1761. He was saved by the death of Tsarina Elizabeth of Russia and the ascension to the throne of the Prussophile Tsar Peter III, and this tipped the scales back in Frederick's favour. The war ended in 1763 with the treaties of Paris and Hubertusburg. Prussia had survived the war, and the European map reverted largely to the status quo antebellum. Overseas, however, the situation was very different, and Britain has significantly overtaken France, her most serious rival, in colonial domination. Turning now to the British involvement in Northwest Europe. An enduring aim of British policy was the preservation of the liberties of Europe, balancing power by throwing effort onto the scales in favour of the weaker side. A key figure in Britain's foreign policy was William Pitt the Elder, whose role in the prioritisation of America or Europe was profoundly important. In Pitt's view, ministers paid far too much attention to the royal fixation, Georgian fixation, with Hanover. However, he was subtle enough to recognise a relationship of interdependence between the colonies and European involvement. This is a map of northwest Germany, and it shows the battles leading up to Minden. Towards the left-hand side of the map is the River Rhine. Towards the right-hand side, middle of the map, is Hanover, which of course was vital to British interests. Towards the middle of the map, on the River Weser with the cross swords, is Minden, and just below that is Gofeld. I'm sorry I don't have a cursor facility, so I'll be having to talk you through the slides in this way. French advances into Germany in 1757 was sufficient provocation for the Elector of Hanover, our King George II, to declare war, and Pitt agreed to fund the defence of Hanover and effectively Frederick of Prussia's western flank. Britain's first foray into mainland Europe wasn't a great success. Pitt agreed to an army of observation, rather a toothless tiger, mainly Hanoverian, and William Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland, was an obvious candidate to command it. At the key Battle of Hastenbeck, and Hastenbeck is towards the right of your screen, pretty central again on the River Weser. Cumberland, despite inflicting greater casualties on the enemy, abandoned the field, and he withdrew north, giving up his defence of Hanover, and Westphalia was overrun by the French in 1757. Under the Treaty of Closter-7, Cumberland's losing army was disbanded, and he was obliged to return home to face his father's anger. Everything seemed bleak, with the Austrians even occupying Berlin briefly, until Frederick suddenly turned the tide in a resounding victory over the Franco-Austrians at Rossbach. And George II, acting as King of Great Britain, then overturned his son's surrender and resumed hostilities. At this point, I must introduce Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick, Frederick's brother-in-law. the ideal candidate as the fresh Allied commander. In November 1757, he quickly re-energized the army, mounting an aggressive winter campaign. The French army, overwintering away from home, was in no fit state to resist. So the occupation of Westphalia deflated, and the French withdrew back across the Rhine. The Allies moved quickly to fill the void left by the French. A 1st British infantry battalion landed in Emden, towards the top left-hand side of the slide. Ferdinand now aimed at nothing less than the destruction of his French opponents. In an offensive timed to coincide with British amphibious operations on the North French coast, he intended to pursue the French across the River Rhine. He used pontoons to cross it and won a tricky battle at Krefeld, left side of your slide, in June, which was a catalyst for further British commitment to the continent. The Duke of Marlborough and Lord George Sackville, both previously involved in but now bored by their amphibious coasting, as they called it, managed to elbow themselves onto this new venture, with Marlborough being assigned as the British commander. However, Ferdinand had overreached himself and had a small stiff fight at Ries to regain the home bank of the Rhine. Now, on the French side, the Minister of War directed that 2 armies were to coordinate their actions, with the Army of the Rhine to the north under Contades and the Army of the Main under Soubise to the south. So Ferdinand was outnumbered and opposed by 2 strong French armies working in concert. The 2 French armies were joined by 9,000 Saxons under Prince Zava, who had escaped the clutches of Frederick the Great. Soubise occupied Kassel, down towards the bottom right-hand side of your slide, throwing the government in Hanover into chaos and evacuating the city up to Stade, up to the top of your slide. Back on his home bank of the Rhine, Ferdinand was able to marry up with the recently arrived British contingent of 6 regiments of cavalry, 6 regiments of infantry and supporting artillery at Gofeld, which is middle of the slide towards the left-hand side. And this brought the Allied army up to a theoretical strength of over 66,000. And if you want to visualize that, Murrayfield has a capacity of 67,000. Anecdotally, the 2 Protestant allies of Britain and Hanover got on very well together, drinking long into the night and swapping stories, though scarcely able to understand each other. Soubise actually managed to get some light cavalry up to the very walls of Hanover, and Ferdinand tried to get in behind him, but a small Allied force was caught and mauled at Lutterberg, just to the north of Kassel, in October. Meanwhile, Ferdinand decided to overwinter in Münster, just left of the centre of the map. But the commander of the British contingent, the Duke of Marlborough, had succumbed to dysentery and had died. And his successor, Lord George Sackville, was something of a Marmite character. Often appreciated by his subordinates, he seemed to have the unfortunate knack of rubbing his superiors up the wrong way. And he seemed also to resent being commanded by a German. In March 1759, Soubise was replaced by Broye, who occupied Bergen, just north of Frankfurt, down towards the bottom of the slide. Ferdinand tried to pounce on Broye at Bergen, but was forced to withdraw all the way back up to Osnabrück, dead centre of the slide, while the 2 French armies united at one of Ferdinand's main blocking points, Kassel, towards the bottom right. The French maintained pressure on Ferdinand, and they identified that Minden, which had plentiful stocks of rations and ammunition, might be captured. If they could seize that, they could interpose themselves between Ferdinand and Hanover at a key crossing point over the River Weser, only 60 kilometers west of Hanover. Broye sent his younger brother ahead with a light force. So let's understand the terrain. Towards the center of the slide is a fortification, and that is Minden in northwest Germany. You can see that from this map that it's a sort of Vauban-esque construction. And to its east is the River Weser, which runs north up to the North Sea. To the south of Minden and running east to west is the Wiehengebirge Ridge, quite a steep ridge with saddles, but there's a break in it through which the River Weser flows. And that is called Porta Westfalica, or as we call it, the Minden Gap, colloquially. As I said, Hanover lies some 60 kilometers to the east, and Gofeld, which we'll return to later, is on the other side of the Wiehengebirge Ridge, about 16 kilometers, 15, 16 southwest of Minden. Just below Minden and flowing eastwards into the Weser is the Bastau stream, a fairly narrow little stream, and yet, as you'll see in a short time, still enough to pose an obstacle to most armies, certainly 18th century armies, but with vehicular traffic nowadays, it would pose an obstacle to most modern armies. Near its source, where the land is extremely flat, the stream would burst out and fuel a moor, a turf moor, a morass or swamp called Hillemoor. To the northwest of Minden is Minden Heath, where the action took place. It's called a heath. It's not covered in heather or Minderheide. It's grassy farmland. But round about the heath is a circle of little villages. And I would draw your attention, going from left to right on the slide, to the village of Hille. And just south of that is Eichhorst. And then as you get closer into Minden, I draw your attention to the village probably closest, which is Hallen, and Hartum, which is the next one along to the west. As you go north of Minden, up the Weser, there's a settlement called Eichhof, and north of that still is Totenhausen, and these all feature pretty much in our tale. There's the Weser. As you can see, quite a significant river. Can be pretty fast flowing. That's a photograph taken from the east bank. You cannot see Minden itself, which is behind the trees. But if you look upriver, or downriver actually, you'll see two bridges. The farthest one effectively is a replacement of what used to be the main road to Hanover. And that was protected on this bank by an outerwork, a hornwork. You can also see a pedestrian bridge, and that was the site pretty close to of a ford. So all relevant. And this is the Bastau. It's been a bit landscaped in this suburban area. It's quite a narrow little stream, but it's got a very sort of muddy, boggy bottom. And as you can see from the banks, could be a bit of an obstacle if you're trying to kind of get through there. So one of my favorite parts of this story. The younger Broy, rather than approaching Minden from the west, managed to cross the River Weser upstream, and he approached then from the southeast, but with only a light cavalry force, he doubted that he could storm the fortress. Contemporaneous map by Roy, a lovely map which shows Minden, shows the bridge over the River Weser, which would lead eastwards to Hanover, and it shows the hornwork as well. The two bridges to the south of the main bridge were pontoons which the French put in after they had captured Minden. Now, some French hussars patrolling along the river learnt of a punt which was hidden on the far bank on the 9th of July. And at night, some bold Frenchmen swam the river and brought back the punt. And by that means allowed 40 men at a time to be ferried over, creating a small lodgement just under the fortress walls. And by that means 300 men were across. A few light guns enfiladed the hornwork while Broy's light troops attacked, forcing the defenders from the hornwork, and in their haste leaving a drawbridge open. This then allowed the 300 to secure an entrance to the fortress, effectively from the rear, capturing 200 prisoners. So the fort, its supplies, and the Weser crossing were all now in French hands, and the way to Hanover was open. The French converged in Minden, and Ferdinand's situation was now desperate. And by the 14th of July, the French appeared to be in an impregnable position. You can see there's a village to the south of Minden called Dutzen, and Contad's army nestled in that triangle between the ridge, the stream, the Minden and Weser, while Broy's subordinate corps was on the east bank of the Weser. But as I said earlier, the French threw 2 pontoons across, and the subordinate corps and now Contad's main body were less than a half day's march away by these crossings. Contad's overall force was 48,250 strong, 35,000 for himself and 13,000 for Broy. I said that the position of Contad's force was pretty impregnable. To the western end of it, this is a little artillery platform that was constructed just in the lee of the ridge. It's now somebody's back garden. The retaining wall has since been added, but it's quite a nice little feature. Ferdinand now had a dilemma. He was 2 days away from a magazine at Nienburg, north of Minden on the River Weser, but the French could reach it in half the time. Alternatively, he could go west or southwest towards Münster and be maintained along the River Ems, but that would fail in his mission of protecting Hanover. So as it was, he struck east towards the River Weser. So we'll look at preparations and plans. Ferdinand had approached the fortress from the northwest, but as I said, the French position seemed impregnable. So he planned a series of moves designed simultaneously to tempt, but also to threaten Contad to draw him out into the open. On the 16th, he moved to Petershagen, at the top of the slide up on the Weser. And over the next 2 weeks, he started to drive in French outposts. On the 17th of July, he ordered a conspicuous march out onto Minden Heath, but leaving a corps under Wangenheim near Totenhausen. Totenhausen is between Petershagen and Minden, north of Minden on the Weser, and that corps was 12,700 strong. Ferdinand's main encampment was to be to the northwest of Minden, between Nordhemmern and Friedewalde, with pickets out in the villages. And he sited his own headquarters at Hille, just to the north of Eichhorst, towards the source of the Bastau. The Allied frontage was 15 kilometers. I'll come back to that slide a couple of times. This is the view from Nordhemmern, which was the Allied main body, main camp. It's looking southeast. You can see in the distance the Minden Ridge, or the Wiengebirge Ridge, and you can see the Minden Gap. There's a hole in the ridge, and Minden lies to the north of that. You can't really see it. It's in slightly dead ground. As I said, it's sort of farming and grassy terrain. So we've got 76,000 men in a 10-kilometer radius. And if you want to imagine 76,000 men, that's the capacity of Old Trafford. For the French, with about 48,000, the Parc des Princes has a capacity of just over 47,000. I mentioned that Ferdinand wanted to both threaten and tempt Contad out of his secure positions. And here we are. This is the chap he wanted to send to pose the threat part. This is the prince, the eldest son of the Duke of Brunswick. And he was sent with 9,700 men towards Lübeck, which is out to the west of Minden, and then south across the ridge towards Gofeld to threaten Contad's communications, which ran up through Hereford. So he was sent out to the west to Lübeck, down through that saddle, and to threaten Gofeld. In Contad's mind now, there must have been competing pressures. He had Ferdinand's main force to his northwest, with a seemingly isolated force out towards Totenhausen, that isolated corps. And he had a threat developing in his rear, so he had to do something. And he had that temptation of Wangenheim's isolated body up north at Totenhausen. Contades felt that he could afford to detach 8,000 men under the Duke de Brissac to protect his own line of communications, and specifically to prevent the Erbprinz from taking Gofeld. So now was the time for Contades to strike out at the Allies in the dispersed positions before they could concentrate. We now turn briefly to the parallel and concurrent battle at Gofeld, which was part of Ferdinand's wider scheme of developing these simultaneous threats and temptations for Contades. And it took place 15 or 16 kilometres south of Minden at the same time as Ferdinand was luring the French out of their strong positions near Minden. And those are the forces involved. Almost parity. The Allies maybe had just shy of 2,000 more. The Erbprinz had been tasked with threatening the French line of communications, and he had been directed to cross the Wiehengebirge ridge and then swing eastwards. And his mission quickly had the desired effect, because Contades detached the Duke de Brissac. As you can see, the Wiehengebirge ridge is up at the top of the slide there. But the 31st, the Erbprinz was in the vicinity of Kirchlengern, and de Brissac moved quickly onto the post road at Gofeld, specifically the Gofelder Werrebrücke, the river Werre, the bridge over that. The Erbprinz decided to strike de Brissac the next morning, the 1st of August, and his plan was to envelop him, dividing his force into 3 parts. In the centre was Lieutenant General von Kielmansegg with 4 battalions and the bulk of his artillery, and he was to advance along the north bank of the Werre to engage de Brissac frontally to fix him. Meanwhile, the Erbprinz and General Dreyfus would cross to the south bank of the river Werre and strike de Brissac's left flank with 4 squadrons of dragoons and 3 battalions. The third element, under Major General von Bock, would swing round to the north and reach out to the east of Gofeld as a cut-off group, preventing the French from withdrawing up to the Minden Gap or eastwards. And that is the modern Gofelder Werrebrücke. The Allies started at 3 o'clock in the morning, but de Brissac didn't wait passively. Leaving 2 companies to guard the bridge, he took the bulk of his force to the northwest to engage the Allied main body. And this is where he did it. This is now known as the Bloody Meadow. And the engagement started out as a sort of Mexican standoff, a stalemate, until the French attempted to charge the Germans as they were deploying. But the charge was shattered by Hanoverian musketry. Meanwhile, to the south, the Erbprinz advanced to the bridge. And as soon as de Brissac realized that his left flank had been turned, he ordered a withdrawal northwards in the direction of Minden. But he then ran into von Bock's cut-off group, which had deployed artillery. At that point, de Brissac's force dissolved, and it was as individuals that it headed northeastwards back towards Minden. The Allies captured 300 prisoners of war and 5 cannon, and in subsequent years, 1,900 skeletons were discovered. So we get to the meat and the sandwich now. Minden, you've been waiting a long time for it. On the 31st of July, Ferdinand's main army lay encamped between Hille and Friedewalde, facing southeast with pickets out in front. There was only one feasible crossing of the Bastau stream, which is between Eichhorst and Hille, and Ferdinand had blocked this with a Brunswick battalion and 2 guns. On the 31st, both commanders had finished their plans. Ferdinand assessed that Contades' positions were too costly for him to attack, so he baited his trap, and he aimed to draw Contades out to defeat his seemingly dispersed force in detail. Wangenheim's corps of 12,000 up at Totenhausen must have looked tempting, and he also assessed that those features which made Contades' situation difficult to attack would also make it more difficult to break out from. And if he could catch Contades mid-move and astride the obstacles, he would catch him at a disadvantage. But this all hinged on early warning and then on prompt concentration. So he ordered all his commanders to familiarise themselves with the ground and the routes onto Minden Heath. His aim was to advance forwards and concentrate his force, a bit like a shrinking perimeter or a purse net, for those who still indulge in field sports. And he would do this in 8 converging columns. To give you examples, the first column on the Allied right was to be under Sackville and was to be 24 mixed squadrons or squadrons mixed of Allied cavalry. And the third column from the right was under a Hanoverian General von Spocken, containing 2 brigades of British infantry under Waldegrave and Kingsley, and 2 battalions of Hanoverian Guards. Ferdinand's orders were clear on the approach march, but they didn't include any mention of effects they were to achieve once on the heath. And his orders were distributed in writing. Contades wrote his orders, but also delivered them in person to his subordinates. And his plan was to bring Broy's corps over the Weser under cover of darkness, and then use that corps supplemented as his main effort to attack Wangenheim's dislocated corps at Totenhausen. And he wanted a rapid attack to drive Wangenheim backwards away from the rest of the Allied main body. He could then dominate Ferdinand's left flank. Broy had effectively 16,000 men, 13,000 of his own, and another 3,000 on his left flank under Nikolai, 10 additional guns. As a feint, 4 battalions of infantry were to attack Hiller across the causeway. And in concert with these, Contades' main army would cross the Bastow using improvised portable bridges and manoeuvre out onto the heath. 63 squadrons of cavalry supported by 3 brigades of infantry and 30 guns. Further left still, and intended to hold the line of villages just to the north of the Bastow, Hallen and Hartem, would be 4 brigades of infantry under the Comte de Guerchy, supported by a further 13 battalions of Saxons under Prince Zava. And all this was to be conducted under the cover of night. 18 portable wooden bridges were constructed. So to summarize, the main attack was to be by De Broy, supplemented against Wangenheim, confident that his left flank was protected by the bulk of the French army. An odd little episode was that of Lorman, the spy of Minden, who made his way to Ferdinand's headquarters, telling him of the French intention to attack the Allies at Totenhausen. Thus warned, Ferdinand issued orders for extra vigilance. And the horse was to be saddled at 1 o'clock in the morning, and the men were to rest fully accoutered. At last light, the French began to move. The bridges were carried towards the Bastow. Broy's corps crossed the river Weser, went through Minden, and headed northwards towards Totenhausen. And they used a ditch near the village of Eichhof, called Wallfahrtsteich, as a sort of final assault position. Contades' men streamed out of their tent lines down towards the Bastow. At 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 French deserters were picked up and taken to the general officer of the day, the Prince of Anhalt. But for some unaccountable reason, 2 hours elapsed before Ferdinand was informed. And this was a grave error in a plan where timing was critical. As soon as Ferdinand was alerted, he ordered the Allied army to stand to and to march at best speed using the routes they'd already reconnoitred. I said I would break Minden into 5 broad phases. And we're going to look at the shaping operations, the Allied right. Then we're going over to the other side to see what happened at Totenhausen. And then we'll concentrate on von Sporken's column with the British infantry supported by British artillery. Phase 4 is the Germans completing the destruction of the French centre. And then we'll look at the events associated with the Allied cavalry on the Allied right. So those were our dispositions. Shortly after 3 o'clock in the Eichhorst area, Eichhorst-Hiller area, a bombardment began with 6 guns brought there in the night. However, any French attempt to force the causeway was blocked by the Brunswick battalion and 2 guns, and Ferdinand sent another 2 to reinforce the position. Ferdinand's immediate priority was the security of the village of Hallen. That's that village pretty close to Minden and just north of the Bastei. And he intended that to be an anchor for his right flank. And he rode to the village just short of it, Hartum, just to the west of Hallen. And he ordered the picket there to advance the 2.5 kilometers to seize Hallen before the French. And there's Hallen Church. It predates the battle, so it was there during the battle. To Ferdinand's horror, he learnt that the French had narrowly beaten him to it, and that the lead elements of 2 battalions of the Brigade Champagne, what a great name for a formation, were already there. Nevertheless, he ordered the pickets to push on and at all costs force the French out. In fact, he discovered that the Prince of Anhalt, yes, remember him, had moved forward from Hartum, but he'd stopped just short of Hallen, allowing the French to enhance their hold on the village. In what must have been an interview without coffee, Ferdinand gripped Anhalt and ordered him in. And an attack was put in the nick of time, driving the enemy off, although the French fired many of the houses as they retired. Interesting psychological point about attack, counterattack, and timing in terms of the mindset of the respective bodies. However, the concentration in Hallen had distracted Ferdinand from what was happening on the opposite flank, and Wangenheim hadn't bothered to send any word. So we'll look across to the Allied left now. As dawn broke at about 4:30, it would be possible to see smoke rising to the east around Totenhausen. So Ferdinand's army was engaged simultaneously at 3 points, at Hille, at Hallen, and at Totenhausen. Broye reinforces the French main effort, had 24 battalions, supported by a further 2 brigades, effectively about 16,000 men. And he opposed Wangenheim's corps of 15 battalions, about 12,700 men. Broye's corps used this ditch, Wallfahrtsteig, which I mentioned as a sort of final assault position. And he advanced in 3 lines with artillery well forward. Broye's leading troops bounced Wangenheim's sentries about 30 minutes before dawn. After an initial exchange of fire, Wangenheim's pickets withdrew. For some inexplicable reason, though, rather than exploit their initial success, the French settled down to bombard Wangenheim's forward posts. The advantage lay with Broye, but rather than press home, he now waited for Nicolai's brigades to come up on his left, and perhaps also because it wasn't quite fully light. On the German side, after a slightly dilatory start, Wangenheim made up for lost time and marched his force forward to his allocated deployment positions. By the time it was fully light, the French could now see a corps advancing towards them. Having paused to allow Nicolai's brigades to come on his left, Broye assumed that the forward movement of Wangenheim's corps was a full-blown counterattack, rather than simply a move to occupy positions. Broye halted his force in order to repel what he assumed to be an attack in strength. So the French main effort had faltered. Let's look at von Spurken's division now. This is a situation pretty much taken from Roy's map. The situation shortly after 6. And you can see the respective armies with the Spurken's formation is in the middle of the picture, slightly left, as that rather oddly isolated formation in red. Back towards the Allied right, after 5 o'clock in the morning, the action to clear the French from Hallen had its effect, allowing 2 British light artillery batteries under Captains Drummond and Foy to go into action about 300 metres northwest of Hallen, suppressing French batteries beyond the village. Now, much is made of the French having cavalry in the centre, cavalry denoted by the sort of diagonally hatched symbols there. But in fact, both armies had horse in the centre, expecting to sweep east in support of the main effort at Totenhausen. Between 6:30 and 7 o'clock in the morning, Spurken's column had shaken out into line of battle, passing through a line of fir trees and out onto the heath. At this point, both armies were effectively still deploying, and Ferdinand sent the infamous message, which was received by the second line, that they should engage any enemy forces appearing to their front. And this set Spurken's column off at almost a running march. Ferdinand's own draft account doesn't quite tally, but a definitive version was used at Sackville's court-martial, and I'm grateful to Christian Roger for drawing attention to research in the last decade by Walter Mediger in Germany, which is changing my thinking on it. Here's Spurken's formation with 2 brigades, Waldegraves in front and Kingsley's to the rear, with the 2 battalions of Hanoverian Guards on the left flank. As the British and Hanoverians emerged from the stripwood, a large body of enemy horse could be seen about 1,000 metres away, and this was the first line of Fitzjames's horse. From the French perspective, Spurken's redcoats must have looked exposed, especially as no formed body had appeared between them and Hallen. And this is on Minden Heath, looking southeast towards Minden. You can see the gap. So Minden is below the gap. You can't really see it properly. The road stretching away from you runs down towards Hallen. So that road gives a really good impression of the Allied lines of Spurken's formation. The road running off to your left gives a really good impression of the Allied axis of advance. Now, it's slightly skewed away from Minden, and that's because it was a continuation of the approach march, which is just a nice curiosity. The speed of the Spurken's advance must have surprised Ferdinand, who attempted to slow it so that the troops wouldn't be short of breath when they grappled with the enemy, but to no avail. The lines came under fire from 60 French artillery pieces in the vicinity of Hallen, and the 2 flank battalions of the 12th and 20th of Foot suffered the most, but the advance continued. Lieutenant Thompson of the 20th Foot wrote from hospital afterwards, "I saw heads, legs and arms taken off every minute." It was at that point that Contades sent word to Broye to halt his advance. It had already halted, while Fitzjames dealt with this bizarre manoeuvre. So the order was given for 12 squadrons under the Marquis de Castries to attack. That's over 1,000 horsemen. And the charge was built up from the trot, galloping at only the last moment. It was vital for the infantry to hold its nerve. The order was given to halt. The first rank would kneel, and the other 2 ranks would close up, locking in like a phalanx. The order was given to fire at about 40 metres range, possibly less, crashing out and bringing down horses and riders. The effect must have been awful, with dead and dying horses and riders. The charge was ruined, but still with the capacity to kill with the momentum of tumbling horseflesh. And if you can think of the Grand National and Beecher's Brook and the effect that a few horses falling have on the rest, then you start to get the picture. Within the infantry, the order was given to reload, and sergeants would order men forward to plug holes in the ranks. Fitzjames ordered his second line to attack, that's 22 squadrons under Dumisnil. Despite the obstacles to their front, they nevertheless managed to raise a charge. Another tremendous volley crashed out, bringing down men and horses. Before the French could organise another charge, the drums beat out and the Allied lines stepped off again. The advance rendered Spurken's column even more vulnerable, this time to Gouachy's infantry on the French left wing, and he ordered 8 battalions forward to engage, and this was a vulnerable moment. But Waldegrave could see the risk, and he ordered the 12th and 37th of Foot to refuse a flank, presenting a greater number of musket barrels towards the enemy. A musketry battle ensued, and despite the inaccuracy of the individual weapon, at close range and against a mass target, it was murderous. Gradually, though, the superiority of British musketry told, and Gouachy's Foot melted away, leaving dead and dying. However, rather like the curtains opening on a stage, this revealed a greater threat, a regiment of apparently grenadiers. Montgomery calls them as fine and terrible looking fellows as I ever saw. He also describes them as having rifles with superior range, which the British had to advance through in order to be able to engage. They drove them off, but the enemy reformed again just out of normal musket range, so the 12th and 37th had to repeat the performance again. You might want to ask questions about these weird grenadiers and their rifles. By this stage, the second line had come forward, so Spoken's division was effectively one long line. As an indication of the intensity of this, the roll call of the 12th Foot shows that the battalion could later muster only 4 officers and 13 files of unwounded men. So that's 13 files out of somewhere between 120 and 200 files. Kingsley's horse was fatally wounded in 4 places and collapsed, trapping him to be twice advanced over by Saxon infantry. At this point, the French launched their cavalry reserve, 18 squadrons of the Gendarmes de France and Carabiniers under de Poyen. Ferdinand saw the vulnerability of his line and he ordered forward Hanoverians and 30 heavy guns to support the 6 English regiments who have behaved like a brazen wall from their left. The 2,000 of the French reserve couldn't achieve a frontal charge, so they worked around towards Spoken's left, and just as they were about to crash into the threadbare regiments, the Hanoverian artillery blasted them from the field. So the line had wavered, but it had held just, and the moral effect of having repelled the French cavalry now left the French vulnerable to rout. So we'll look at what happened with the Germans in the French centre. Contad's centre still had 8 battalions of infantry of Beauprieu's corps to the south of Mulberg camp, and Contad sent a rapid order for them to attack the Allied foot. And this took place exactly as von Imhoff's column of Hessians was coming forward, and the momentum was now in the Allies' favour. 4 battalions of Imhoff's Hessians came forward at the double and put in a spirited charge before Beauprieu's brigades could deploy fully, forcing them back at bayonet point. And at this point, the Duke of Holstein's column of 19 cavalry squadrons arrived from Stemmer, swirling around and driving the French foot back onto the remnants of their own cavalry. A further 8 French battalions remained uncommitted under Saint-Germain behind de Beaupreu, but they were to face a fresh threat from Wangenheim. And just as Saint-Germain's 2 brigades began to move forward, they were met by the battalions on Wangenheim's right. The French centre was dissolving, and panic now communicated itself through the French remnants. The army began to lose confidence and to stream rearwards, as they did. Broy directed his corps to act as rearguard, which it did, retiring back under the safety of Minden's garrison guns by about 10 o'clock. Let's look at Sackville's cavalry. There have been several opportunities for Lord Sackville's 24 squadrons of cavalry to intervene there on the left-hand side of your slide. And Ferdinand's aim had been for Sackville's column to move in concert with the rest of the army. Several attack options existed, but as yet there was still no sign of Sackville's troopers, who were hidden behind some trees. The cavalry had received an order to move out at 4:45, and it was formed up under the Marquis of Granby by 5:30, who went off to look for Sackville in his accommodation. On his arrival, Sackville had ordered the force to move off at a walk. He was met by a guide, and despite his relatively tardy start, reached his forming up point before Spoken's column had passed through the stripwood. The cavalry then deployed into 2 lines. And you can see it's a mixture of British cavalry and German. Sackville commanding the first line and Granby commanding the second. One of Ferdinand's ADCs arrived with orders to move through some trees to the left and to form behind Kingsley's brigade to support the advance. But Sackville seems to have assumed that it was simply a preparatory order. And then another messenger arrived who emphasised that the order was to be obeyed immediately and by all the cavalry. Sackville ordered his horse to draw swords and then led them off to the right, not the left. As he was doing this, another messenger, Lieutenant Colonel Fitzroy, arrived, and he attempted to instill yet more urgency. but he said it was only the British cavalry of a mixed force of British and Hanoverians who were to move. Sackville insisted that all three repeat and clarify their orders. Fitzroy, who outranked the other messengers, insisted that the French were in disarray and that the English cavalry, his term, could earn distinction. The key was that the infantry needed support and urgently, and even 14 squadrons would have had an effect. Ferdinand was deeply anxious, having sent 2 further gallopers to hasten Sackville, and he stated, "When is the cavalry coming? Good God, is there no way of getting the cavalry to advance?" Instead, Sackville rode forward through the belt of trees to seek clarification from Ferdinand himself. Fitzroy led at the gallop, but Sackville approached at a more controlled pace. For Ferdinand, this was the last straw, and he directed Fitzroy to seek out Granby and bring on the second echelon, saying, "At least he'll obey me." Granby rapidly grasped the situation and quickly set the second line in motion, but he had to manoeuvre around the stationary first line. Sackville trotted up to Ferdinand and asked what his orders meant. Ferdinand's response was controlled and restrained. "My lord, the opportunity is now past." Turning back, Sackville saw Granby's line coming forward, but ordered him to halt to restore the original order of march. And after a long unnecessary delay, the 24 squadrons were formed into one long line at the start point of Spurken's advance. But by now the infantry had long gone and their backs could be seen in the distance. So rather than turn a victory into rout, Sackville's cavalry had been kept pristine, to the immense frustration of its commanders. Let's look at the sequelae. By 10 o'clock, the battle was effectively over. Contades ordered a general withdrawal, but it was already happening without orders. And by 11, the French were back across the Bastow, running apparently like a flock of sheep, escaping up towards the ridge. Concern was expressed by the lack of cavalry pursuit. Contades called a council of war, and rather than withdrawing down south through the Minden Gap, because of word that had arrived from Gofeld, it was decided to cross the Weser onto the east bank and to escape that way, which happened on the 2nd of August, the 2 pontoon bridges being destroyed behind them, so there was no rapid pursuit. The French were forced to retreat southwards to Kassel and then west towards Frankfurt before falling into a passive lull for the rest of the year. And they were not successful in venturing back to Hanover for the remainder of the war. For the Allies, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, they advanced towards the fortress, stopping just out of artillery range. An officer and trumpeter was sent to demand the fortress's surrender, which was declined until the following day, when the garrison left along with the main French army. For the Allies, there was the imperative to reorganize and collect the wounded. With as many as 1,000 live casualties, the regimental surgeons would have had their hands full. A main field hospital had been set up at Petershagen up to the north, but it then moved into Minden. And the spot at Walfertsteich, that ditch near Eichhof on the Weser, where the Grenadier de France and the Grenadier Royaux had been repelled by Wangenheim's corps, was thick with dead and wounded. And it was there that the Germans erected the monument on the century anniversary of the battle at the point of French main effort. And this is a little private cemetery right on the heath. It belongs to a local family. The dead were collected and buried in mass graves, with as many as 2,000 local peasants being pressed for the task. This cemetery is an interesting one because after the Second World War, the farmer's family believed that there were Brits in that little cemetery. Sadly, by the 1980s, a new generation had come along, and that memory had gone, which is rather sad. Orders were issued for a service of Thanksgiving on the 2nd, followed by a feu de joie. A fairly busy slide, for which I apologise, but it's quite important. Roughly 14,000 casualties, 15,000. And if you want to try and grasp that in your mind, Wimbledon Centre Court, when it's full, has just shy of 15,000. Now, our casualty figures are a mix of killed, wounded, and missing. The French figures are quite hard to divine, but a key point was they lost certainly 6 generals and 438 other officers, both killed and wounded. The French regiment de Touraine, which had been in the French centre, lost 909 out of 1,230. 28% of the French cavalry force was lost, 33% of the Saxons, including their commander, Prince Sava, who'd been wounded. On the Allies, 2,800, and the British supplying 50% of that. The 20th Foot experienced the highest casualty numbers at 317, 51% of its strength. They were in Kingsley's brigade, the second line, but they were physically closest to Hallen. In the order of the day following the battle, the 20th Foot was actually taken out of the line, that because of its severe losses, it should cease to do duty, a measure to which the regiment refused to submit, resuming at its own request its place in the line. We're nearly finished. I just want to touch on Sackville. It would be appropriate to consider his fate. There had been puzzlement in the Allied ranks about the non-appearance of Sackville's cavalry, and Ferdinand had kept the worst of his anger with Sackville under control during the battle, but when he occupied Minden, he issued a special order of the day, in which he publicly thanked most, but not all, of his subordinates. Another one that was missing was the Prince of Anhalt. Ferdinand praised Granby, stating that if he'd had him at the head of the cavalry on the right wing, the decision of the day would have been more complete and brilliant. Sackville was mortified by this and canvassed for his inclusion, but that was refused, and Ferdinand sought Sackville's removal from George II. Sackville appealed for a court-martial before he could be dismissed from the army, and a warrant was issued that Sackville had disobeyed Ferdinand on the field of battle, a capital offence. The trial lasted 6 weeks in 1760, and conflicting views of his conduct emerged. He had very loyal subordinates who spoke in his defence, but politically this was impossible for the king, as there was implied criticism of Ferdinand's style of command. Sackville's acquittal would embarrass the king. So he was pronounced guilty, and whilst not executed, adjudged unfit to serve his majesty in any capacity whatsoever. So his name was erased from the Privy Council, and his disgrace was published in the order book of every regiment of the British Army. Everybody else seems to give a plug, so why not? There we have it. It was a great victory by an Allied army, with a notable part played by the infantry and artillery, and it's still celebrated by the regiments and batteries involved on Minden Day, 1st of August, Lammas Day. So we've covered the context, we've covered the British involvement in Northwest Europe, we looked at the battles of Gofeld and Minden, and we have touched briefly on Sackville's court-martial. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ewan. Let me just take those slides down. There are a number of questions, as you would imagine, and I thank Yolanda, who's in the audience, because she's been answering some of them on your behalf. So I will only ask the questions that haven't been answered.
I'll just interject that I'm confident that Yolanda's answers would be far better than mine.
Paul has asked, what is Ewan's opinion on the recent essay on the tactical failure of the French cavalry?
Yes, no, that's a book that's possibly referring to the book in honor of Christopher Duffy. I haven't really read it in sufficient detail to do it justice. I think, much is made of the French having the cavalry in the centre, saying that was really unconventional. In truth, it wasn't unconventional because it had happened before, and doctrinally the French could do that. the generally accepted tradition is that you would have infantry in the centre, cavalry in the flanks, unless they were anchored on some sort of key point. The other parts, if I'm talking about the right essay, is the surprise that there wasn't a square formed and that they'd been beaten by infantry in line. I'm not too worried about that because the effect of your line was fairly long in a brigade, and you had this sort of phalanx like effect. So I may be talking about the wrong essay, but generally speaking, the outcome was what it was, and that the British infantry were recognised in Europe as sort of up for it, have a go type lads. And in fact, Spurken's formation moving forward almost at the double, Ferdinand tried to get them to slow down because there was a German approach that your troops needed to arrive at the firefight not out of breath. But it was recognised that it would be difficult to stop the Brits, which is quite fun. I don't know if I've really answered the question properly. Forgive me.
Paul has asked that there's not been much mention of the British batteries in this account.
I can understand the question. I did mention Drummond and Foy's batteries suppressing the artillery at round about Hallen. I haven't mentioned McBean, and for that, to any disciples of St. Barbara in the audience, I suspect he must be one. Yes, I apologise. It is a pretty protein-rich talk, and I couldn't cover everything.
Rob has said the reference to rifles is an interesting point. Can you expand?
And I'm glad because I was really hoping to answer that one. First of all, Montgomery mentioned that these chaps were grenadiers. Now, the French order of battle had all the French grenadiers on the right flank up at Totenhausen. So who were these chaps? And rifles, did armies use rifles in those days? And the conclusion I've come to after a fair amount of research with German institutions is that these grenadiers were probably dismounted Saxon dragoons who were used in a grenadier role. And that was not uncommon. And also, it was known that during the period immediately before the 7 Years' War, Saxon dragoons had been experimenting with rifles. So it's quite possible that this odd grenadier rifle armed body is Saxon dragoons dismounted, and they brought their rifles with them when they managed to escape the clutches of Frederick the Great. We don't really know, nobody knows, but that's my conclusion.
Thanks, Ewan. Rob's asked another question, which is: were regiments subdivided into battalions during this period, or is
no,
that
very much.
The
battalions, to a certain extent, in this account, the term regiment and battalion for the British Army is interchangeable. The French, different. You had several battalions of the same regiment in their order of battle, but in this case, for the British regiments of foot, when I talk about regiment, effectively it was that battalion. So when you look at the 6 battalions, those were the regiments represented.
There's been a lot of comments in the chat congratulating you on the quality of the photographs that you provided, Ewan, and also the maps. And Ken's asked this question. The last time he led a tour to Minden was in 2006. The first he'd led there was in 1994. Have there been any major developments on the battlefield since?
The key major development on the battlefield is before Ken's first tour. which is the Mittelland Canal that was put in that largely drained a lot of the moors. So the battlefield has changed in that there is a canal, which is a significant feature, running along pretty much parallel to the way that the Bastow runs. So that is a major change. But in terms of Ken's experiences on the field since the 90s, there's quite a lot of that ugly sort of low prefabricated commercial building has gone on round about the villages on Minden Heath. So the views are not totally unobstructed, but there's still plenty to see, and it's a great site to go and visit. So I would encourage anybody who's up for it, definitely get yourself across, because it's well worth going to see. But it's not perfect, in common with many battlefields.
I can second that. This really isn't my period of history, but it is one of my favourite battlefields to guide on, for the reasons that you just mentioned, Ewan. Carol was intrigued. I'll just find her question. Carol was intrigued by your passing reference to the Spy of Minden, and wondered if you might like to elaborate.
Yeah, the chap, what was his name? Jobst Lohrmann, I think was his name. There's a tiny little alleyway in a place called the Fisher Village, which is a sub-part of Minden on the Weser, which is Lohrmann Gasse. I think he was from there. He had a seafaring background, or certainly a river traffic background. And he, for some inexplicable reason, was sent down towards Hereford by the French, possibly because he spoke French, with a pair of shoes, French military shoes, partly as an order, copy this pair of shoes, because the army up at Minden needs them. And he diverted himself and went off to see the Allies, and the shoes were opened up, and in the heel was a message explaining the intention to attack at Totenhausen. So the other charming bit is that at the monument at Eickhoff, across the road, is quite a handsome little step-gabled building, which is known as Gaststätte Lohrmann. So Lohrmann profited out of his spying because he got a pub. I think it might be a Thai restaurant now. It changes a wee bit, but certainly that there's a little handsome cottage near the monument that was his pad, and then his descendants' pad. So there you
go. Thank you. Okay, I think we've covered most of the questions. I was surprised, actually, that no one asked you why the Minden regiments celebrate with roses. Perhaps you might be able to tell us
the
that.
fact is that the Minden regiments do celebrate with roses, and every man is given one or two, and the colours vary depending on the regiment or the battery involved. There are two schools of thought. Did the soldiers pick roses on the way to the battle? In the half light, just woken up, going to battle, you're not going to be bothering to pick roses. I think a more credible thought is that after the battle, when they were enjoying the fruits of victory, there were rose gardens round about, and they may have mimicked the Germans, who wore things in their headgear to show they were on duty, perhaps sprigs of oak, and so on. It may have been a slight taking the mick by the Brits. The lovely tale, though, about roses is that there's an odd tale where in America, in Chicago, I think it is, in the British consulate, somebody sends a bunch of roses there every year. And then there was a gap, and we think that the chap who'd been sending them, maybe it was a lady, had died, but then it was resurrected, possibly as a result of a will. And inquiries were made, but it still remains private. But the answer that was found was that they'd been sent by T.X. Atkins, Thomas Atkins, I think sort of 1759 Albion, which is quite charming. So there's a fan somewhere in America, which is lovely.
One last question then from the audience, and that's from Ken. He corresponded with General Savoy in 1970 and has asked, did you locate his unpublished papers?
Good question. Can't remember. I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Any savoury things I've got are from published works. But if Ken has material that he would be good enough to share, I'm contactable through the society, and I would love to have them. I would just draw attention to my top tip, which is a website called chronoscaf.com, run by a wonderful French Canadian called Richard Couture, and it focuses on the 7 Years' War. It's peer-reviewed stuff. It's run by a band of brothers and sisters who contribute, and it relies on donations. It's a wonderful website, and I would encourage you to take a look and support it.
Yeah, someone in the audience has already put the link in very kindly into the chat box earlier, which is great. Okay, so if someone wanted to learn more about the 7 Years' War, is there a particular source which you would
exactly
recommend?
That the Chronoscaf website, Richard Couture's website. It's fantastic. Okay,
and of course, if you want to know any more about the Battle of Minden, there is a wonderful book written by our tonight's speaker, by funny coincidence, available from Hellion, and it really is the go-to book, I would suggest, on this battle. Ewan, it only remains for me to thank you for giving the talk this evening. We've run to an hour and a quarter, which is our normal length. You've had a loyal following this evening. Most people have stayed for the question and answer session. Just a reminder to everybody that next month's speaker is Dr. John Peaty. He's talking about outfoxing Rommel in North Africa, in the North African campaign. And when you leave the session this evening, it takes you immediately to a link. You can register now for that talk, which is on the 28th of September. Ewan, thank you once again. Thank you to everybody in the audience, and see you next month.